Hi, my name is Cassie Lefevre, Marketing Assistant with the Denver Philharmonic Orchestra, and today we're going to delve into the centerpiece of our Happily Ever After program, Immortal Beloved. To do that, there's no better person to speak to than the composer of the piece and the featured soloist. Nancy Ives and Denise Dillenbeck, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here.
Thanks for doing this.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. I want to start with the most front-facing aspect of this piece, which is, of course, its title. Talk to me a bit about what inspired this piece and how it connects to the story of Beethoven's Immortal Beloved letter.
Well, Denise inspired this piece. Take it away.
Sure. I am somewhat of a Beethoven fan for sure, and have taught classes on him and his life and his works, and over the years felt a lot of appreciation for his contributions in our world. And when Nancy and I had been talking about the idea of a piece to begin with, she had said, well, let's wait and think about what we might want it to be. And then I felt like I just had this beautiful vision one day just come to me about the Immortal Beloved, because it's such an amazing mystery that has stayed with us down through centuries now, about this beautiful, passionate letter that he wrote to some unknown woman that was his beloved. And people have, supposed it might be different people over the years since and proposed different candidates. And I thought, we know about him, we know about this letter, but we don't know about these women. And as we dive in and research them, their issues and their stories are very much relevant, I feel like, still to us today. There's lots of ways that they were not necessarily free to make choices in their lives, and we're striving towards that in wonderful, interesting ways in their different stories. And their lack of freedom to choose necessarily who they wanted to spend their life with, that was Beethoven's situation as well. And so it just was like a really rich place of discovery to begin with.
Yes. And I was instantly captivated with Denise's take on it, and trying to think about how it was for these young women to be in the presence of this genius who was a rock star at that time. He was, we know some composers were not appreciated fully, but Beethoven was appreciated. He was a big deal in Vienna. And this is it was part of his problem, is that he's socializing with members of the aristocracy. So all these people are in the noble class. And one thing we sort of reference in the piece is, Ludwig van Beethoven, it's V-A-N, and that's just a Flemish or Dutch way of saying where you're from, whereas the women are all but one have a V-O-N in their names because they are from this noble class. So this class barrier was very, very present. It was really a main impediment for Beethoven to be with who he loved and for her to be with him. For instance, our favorite, Josephine, who the third movement is all about. Even when she was a widow with children, she couldn't marry Beethoven because her children would have been taken away from her if she married a commoner. So this kind of dilemma for women really drew us emotionally to the story and to wanting to tell their stories and give them a voice in our time. And then as for calling it Immortal Beloved, I thought, that's what it's about. Let's just call it that.
Makes sense. Don't overthink it, right?
Right.
That's fantastic. So how did you even go about starting this piece in terms of researching these potential figures and choosing which ones to highlight? Because obviously there are a bunch of different theories on who this actual Immortal Beloved is.
That was quite a journey.
Yeah, I could dive into this, Nancy, and toss it to you because you'll have the bulk of the stuff to say about this. But we had arranged a time to get together, and we were sort of talking and sharing about some of the things that I had found in my lifetime journey with this Beethoven guy. One of the crucial moments in my experience with him was reading about one of the women that was proposed as a candidate, Josephine von Brunsvik. As I was reading about her, I'd put on randomly Beethoven Piano Sonata in the background. I think I put it on because I knew he had composed that during knowing her and perhaps given it to her. And so I was like, oh, let's just put this on. And then I'm reading about her, and I hear from the very beginning of that piece this motive that sounds like Josephine, and it's throughout the whole movement. And I was like, oh my gosh. And it was so beautiful and so timely and meaningful to me. And so I was passing that along to Nancy and saying, okay, there's these other women, but this one, this is really seems special to me in a lot of different ways. And Nancy, I'll let you take it from there.
Well, and that little motif, it figures throughout the piece because it's like the emotional thread that really opened the whole thing up for both of us. So it was very important. But I remember that when Denise was first telling me about this, and I didn't know that much about it. I knew the letter existed, but I hadn't followed the mystery at all. And she mentioned three, and there's Antony von Brentano, Josephine von Brunsvik, and then later, once I started researching, I could not remember who the third one was that Denise had mentioned. And I said, who was it? And she said, well, I'm not sure, because over the 200 years, there have been so many different women proposed. Now, many of them, it's been proven that they couldn't have been in the right time at the right place. But I also felt that they were worthy of our attention because they were part of this story through these 200 years. When it started, the process, the composition process, I remember looking out over this, what felt like, I sort of have an internal landscape. Like, I guess it's like a mind palace, except it's outdoors. That's how it works for me. And I'm looking out over this, like there's the piece that I haven't, but there's this huge boulder in front of me that says Ludwig. And it was like, how do I see around this massive cultural figure to these women who we're trying to draw attention to, and they felt like they were all in his shadow. But as I learned more, like the thing I mentioned earlier about the class barrier also being a problem for him, I realized he's part of the story. This is also about him, his music, and his presence was a part of their lives. He is part of the story. He's not just, the reason we're telling the story, let's face it, but he's part of the story. So that also made a big difference, because I had thought, should I try to leave out his music? Yet again, paying more attention to the man than to all these women? No, his music was a huge part of their lives. They all loved it. Most of them played it. A lot of them were his students. So at that point, it kind of broke it open. I'm going to use adaptations of quotes from, inspiration from pieces of his that are associated with each individual woman. And it really wasn't that hard to find for most of them, because he actually dedicated pieces to them. We have letters. Beethoven sent me a copy of so-and-so piece with the nicest inscription. Some of them were just the pieces were being, we know that they were being performed around the time that he was getting to know that person, maybe courting her. So there's all different ways that the music connects to the women, but all the music is connected to the women. The starting point for all of this is, of course, the letter itself. I wanted to use the letter as literally embedding the words by setting them to music. So there are melodies that are the words. You won't hear those words. It's just a way of generating melody for me that, to me, embeds the words into it, and that embeds the emotional content of those words. Some of the letter is just why it's so fascinating to people, an impassioned love letter. But some of it is really what I always called mundane material, which is things like the road was muddy and my cart broke down. Literally that kind of just really chatty, mundane stuff. And ultimately that became very poignant to me, because who do you say that stuff to? He's saying these little personal, mundane details to the person he thinks will care the most about that. So I found those very poignant, and I wanted that to be in there as well. Usually in the piano, it's like set like a recitative where my carriage broke down, the road was muddy, that kind of thing, only in German. I use the original German every time, which was a heavy lift because I don't speak German. But I just wanted those words embedded into the music. So that starts with that prologue that introduces that. Then there's some of the letter, and one thing that was so effective in the premiere was the orchestra whispering the beginning of the letter. This is something that the audience won't necessarily be able to detect, is that the orchestra has the words in German and English, but I also indicated that they should feel free to say it in any language they know. And I know we had at least some Korean and something else, and we had multiple languages going on. And it doesn't last for very long, but to me, that just resonated with the universality of the story, the love letter. Ciphering is it's a musical thing that people have been using since the Renaissance, where you assign a letter to a note. Like everyone maybe knows about the BACH that Bach used a lot. I had already done a cipher before where I assigned G, the note G to the letter A and the note G sharp to the letter B. It's truly that simple. And you just do the chromatic scale up with the letters of the alphabet. So that cipher, the melodies using that cipher represent the names of the women. We first hear the solo violin. Well, every time the solo violin does the names of the women, she's the voice of the women. I'm using so many quotes from Beethoven, some of them pretty verbatim, that creates traditional harmony, right? But the ciphers are as atonal as it gets, right? There's no tonality there, it's random. So meshing those musical languages was a fun challenge. Once the decision was made to do 7 different women for part 2, I was like, okay, how do I fit all those in? And I wanted some thread that would musically connect all of those. So it starts with the Von cipher. So that's the cipher melody for VON. That part of the name of the noble women, to me, came to represent the barrier between them and a commoner like Beethoven. That recurs throughout the movement. And then it just launches into each of the 7 women. But every time it has the melody derived from the cipher that Denise will play.
I think it's really a delightful experience to kind of romp through these different women's personalities in a way and just get a little whiff of what their experience, their life might have been like through how Nancy chooses to portray that. And so I just think it's really fun and a lot of variety. It's like being in a hat store trying on different hats, it's like, oh, this one looks cute. Oh, look at this one, as the different women go through.
Now the third movement, that's where the heartbeat of it is for the 2 of us, for sure. It starts with some whispering from the letter. Thematically, it ties in a little bit with the first movement, but then it's almost all about Josephine. There is an epilogue. And one reason there's an epilogue, besides summing up the whole journey of the piece, is that Josephine died before Beethoven did. So it felt important, to sort of depict that fact. One thing Denise said about the second movement, about the personalities, sometimes it was a little hard to find anything out about their personalities. That was part of the challenge of the research, was actually learning more about them, not just where, they happened to be here at this time, but who were they? It wasn't that hard to learn about Josephine because her sister, who had also been considered a candidate and is depicted in the second movement, her sister Therese wrote a memoir and talked a lot about her. There are lots of letters. The problem with Josephine was condensing it enough to be one movement. We came away thinking there should be an opera about Josephine. Her family moved from Hungary to Vienna. And right when Beethoven was becoming famous, not just as a performer, but as a composer for the Pathetique Sonata, their family heard him perform, and Josephine's mom marched right up to Beethoven and got piano lessons for her children from Beethoven. Apparently, it was very obvious very quickly that Josephine and Beethoven had a lot of interest in each other and a lot of affection. And so Josephine's mom very, very, very hastily arranged a marriage that was more appropriate for Josephine. Not long after the marriage, the mom actually wanted Josephine to leave him. But I think at that point she had a child, and also she had that sense of duty, and so she didn't do that. But he still died after 4 years of marriage. So she had 3 children and was a widow. She still would not have had the option to marry Beethoven without risking having her children taken out of her custody. Even during her marriage, she continued to study piano with Beethoven. I think that made it so that they were primed to fall more deeply for each other once she was a widow. And in fact, we know because her sisters were warning her to be careful and trying to get her away from him. There's lots of indications this is a real thing. And in fact, there's a famous incident of a friend of his being at Beethoven's apartment and seeing a copy of this song An die Hoffnung with Opus 32. There's more than one An die Hoffnung. It's the Opus 32, and it is quoted quite a bit in the whole piece, actually. He had a apparently very personal inscription on this copy, and this friend said, "You'd better be careful. You're going to get her in a lot of trouble." Something to that extent. So it was real. And her family was really trying to get her away from him. They were really worried. So that was in 1804 and 5. She ended up getting married again to an Estonian nobleman who, how would you put it, Denise, did her wrong. Ugh.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say he was basically abusive. And I think she had another child, right?
Yeah.
With him, and he ended up taking her children from her. So she's over again trying to do what society expects of her and trying to fulfill the rules the way they've been laid out, and then ends up being kind of ill-used and the victim in these situations. In the end, there's a third man who I think was a tutor hired for her children, who kind of sways her seduces her, and she ends up pregnant again. And I think she just wound up in the end with a lot of illness and a lot of suffering and a lack of family around her. And somewhere in the middle of all of that was possibly this reconnection with Beethoven, where from the way the Immortal Beloved letter lays it out, it sounds like something came to fruition. He's writing in a passionate way that sounds like, let's make plans, let's figure this out.
Right. So much of it is we can't be together. We can't, I understand we can't be together, and how much, if you read the letter with that story in mind, it's very, very poignant. But he's still holding out hope at that point in 1812, you can tell.
In Nancy's piece, I'll say that it's so poignant, like the music that she writes for Josephine. It's so beautiful and sad and perfect and lovely. And you hear that moment of consummation between her and Beethoven. After that, eventually you hear her death. And Nancy told me in the section, this beautiful sad section, I play this note, the orchestra dies, and then I fade away, and that's the end of Josephine. And then after that, Beethoven lives on. And so Nancy has this gorgeous, to me, it's the sound of Beethoven's voice in the trumpet that's almost like a requiem for her after she's gone, and then him having to go about his life with the memory of this beautiful love that they never were able to truly have. And the epilogue, to me, is holding that in a really sacred way and kind of reviewing the hope for that kind of love. Even if life was hard and all these things played out that way, the love itself was pure, and there was beauty to that, and there's honor in that.